Hello, everyone. Good evening. For everyone, I guess, east of Manitoba, and for those west, good late afternoon. My name is Eric Story. I'm the outreach manager at the Laurier Center for Military Strategic and Disarmament Studies, and currently coming to you from my cooking hot apartment in Kitchener. Now, I and the rest of the folks at the Laurier Military Center, as well as our partners, the Canadian Battlefields Foundation, the Juno Beach Center Association, and the Gregg Center for the Study of War and Society, would like to welcome you all to the 7th installment of the Maple Leaf Route webinar series. But before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the extensive history of the land in which the Laurier Military Center resides. Our office is located on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral peoples. In 1701, this land fell under the dish with one spoon treaty between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, a treaty that was part of the Great Peace of Montreal in the same year that marked the end of the Beaver Wars of the 17th century. It represented and continues to represent today an eternal agreement to not only share and protect resources, but also solve conflicts peacefully. 80-some years later, in 1784, the Haldeman Proclamation was signed between the Haudenosaunee and the British Crown following the American Revolution, and the Haudenosaunee were given a tract of land that extended 6 miles on either side of the Grand River from its source just north of Orangeville today to Lake Erie. Today, this treaty territory remains the homeland of Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee communities, as well as the home of many Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island, and acknowledging their presence in the past and present reminds everyone of the responsibilities we all hold as treaty people. Now, I'm sure that most of you that are tuning in tonight have probably come to at least one of the webinars before, but just in case we have a few new folks tuning in, I'll give you a sense of what exactly the Maple Leaf Route webinar series is. Since May and until the end of this month, we've been following the Canadians through the battles of Normandy in 1944, from the D-Day beaches through the capture of Caen in July and the fighting towards Falaise in August. And throughout that fighting, over 5,000 Canadian service people lost their lives. Any visitor to the war cemeteries in Normandy cannot help but be moved by such losses. Our 8-part series, the 7th of which taking place tonight, features a range of historians asking a range of historical questions, and tonight is no different. All of our speakers, however, will reflect in some way on the ever-changing ways we remember the Canadians in the battles of Normandy. Now, if after tonight's event, and even throughout the series, maybe the next one coming up, you feel you have learned something of value, please consider donating to the Canadian Battlefields Foundation and the Juno Beach Center Association. During these difficult pandemic times, your donations will keep future tours alive and ensure that the Canadian contributions to the Second World War will not be forgotten. This month, the Juno Beach Center Association is promoting the Remembrance Day race. For only $50, you will receive a racing kit that includes a medal, a Lancaster bomber pin, Remembrance Day flag, poppy seeds, and even a racing bib. Participants can choose from one of 3 historically significant distance points: the Strong Point at 1,500 meters, Juno Beach at 8 kilometers, and Remembrance at 21.1 kilometers, and fundraise for the Juno Beach Center while they walk or run in order for a chance to win a variety of prizes. Join the Juno Beach Center's journey of remembrance and gratitude as they honor the men and women who served during the Second World War. Now, you can donate to both the Canadian Battlefields Foundation and the Juno Beach Center Association on our website, canadianmilitaryhistory.ca/webinar, and click donate at the top of the page. I'll say that just one more time, canadianmilitaryhistory.ca/webinar. Now, throughout this talk, if questions kind of come into your mind at any point, please share them in the Q&A function located actually at the bottom of your screen. And when you do so, make sure you let us know where you're coming from. We love to know where our crowd is tuning in to these webinars. One more thing before I turn it over to my co-host for this evening. If you find that closed captioning at the bottom of your screen just a little bit distracting, you can actually turn it on and off. Just click that CC button at the bottom and toggle closed captioning on and off. I'll now turn it over to my co-host, Dr. Jeff Hayes.
Thanks, Eric. Where's my video? There it is. Hi, everyone. Uh, the CBF, La Fondation Canadienne des Champs de Bataille, and the Juno Beach Center have worked, as you already know, to ensure that the Canadian role in the campaign and the Normandy campaign remains fresh in the minds of Europeans as well as Canadians. Since 1995, the foundation has brought together a remarkable array of young men and women to tour and learn about the battlefields. And they've included, as I've mentioned before, Indigenous peoples, the grandchildren of veterans, serving members of the Canadian Armed Forces, as well as future teachers, academics, and decision makers. And we'll hear from one of those alumni in a moment. You also know that this is the second year that the CBF has been unable to organize a student tour, and as such, our president, General Marc Lessard, agreed that a virtual tour, drawing, as Eric has noted, on a distinguished panel of academics would offer us a chance for a wider audience to see the Foundation's mandate in practice. It's quite remarkable how wide our audience has become. And once again, at the expense of sounding like public broadcasting, I do hope that you will find ways to contribute to the CBF and the Juno Beach Center, as well as to the Greg Center. So let's set the stage. 11 August, 1944. I'm going to make a special shout out to, the relatives of mine, and I'll make this clear to Andrea and James, who are watching from BC tonight. Their ties to this particular action are quite direct. Their grandfather, great-grandfather, was part of 4 Armored Division that has just been in the theater since the start of the month. We haven't talked much about 4 Armored Division. That includes, of course, the Lincoln Welland Regiment that we know so well in Southern Ontario, as well as the Algonquins and the Argylls and the Lake Superiors, as we'll hear later from our speaker. Together with 2 and 3 Infantry Divisions, along with the Polish Armored Division and 51st Highland Division, they are, at this time, so many years ago, pushing south in the direction of Falaise in the second phase of what we call Operation Totalize. The reckless German counterthrust of 5 days before, in a vain attempt to cut off the American push from the west, has left 2 German armies exposed to the full weight of Allied advance. We're getting to the climax of the battles of Normandy. We're still debating the full implications of these crucial strategic and operational decisions. And we're still trying to come to terms with the impact of these battles on thousands of Canadian service people, including, as Matthew will tell us tonight, on Lieutenant Reginald Woods. Now, I will say that in both method and subject, our discussion tonight is a little bit out of the ordinary. Most of us think of graphic representations as something we find in fictional comic books with Marvel superheroes. It's something that we would see in the movies rather than in serious historical analysis. And we don't often talk much about the psychological effects of battle, but I assure you that Matthew Barrett's work is superb and is well worth exploring. And I would now like to turn it over to Dr. Andrew Birch, a CBF alumni he's an alumnus from 1999, to introduce the speaker for this evening. Thanks, Andrew. What does the CBF mean to you, Andrew?
Jeff, thank you very much for the introduction. It's actually a little hard to say, but made easier by the fact that the CBF, with some foresight, prompted all the attendees on the 2000 study tour. I thought it was 99, it's actually 2000. So literally half a lifetime ago for me, to keep a journal. And so I looked back to the journal, which is actually published in Canadian military history. So it's a great little resource to have to hand. I don't have to go looking for the old little black book. And in the day before I left, I wrote, I have been told that the primary source for any military historian is the battlefield. And this is my opportunity to consult and withdraw from that source what I need. In this way, I also hope to better appreciate the ceremonies of Remembrance Day, to personalize it. In this way, I can ensure its survival in my family. And that was at the outset of the tour. 19 days later, thereabouts, having passed through the D-Day beaches, having passed through Dieppe, gone to the Imperial War Museum and Duxford and all sorts of sites I had never seen before, I had a much better appreciation for both the geography and the history, and how shallow swells in the land had a very, very important effect on the people who fought through those territories at night and muck and horror. And it pushed me forward to keep studying military history through my undergraduate, through my graduate degree, and ultimately to pursue work at the Canadian War Museum, where I work now. And it's there that I had the privilege of meeting and working with my colleague, Matthew Barrett, who's going to be our speaker tonight. And so I'll conclude my comments because we want to get to the presentation by giving him a bit of an introduction. And Matt graduated from Queen's University with a history PhD in 2019, and he's an illustrator, historian, and postdoctoral fellow at the Canadian War Museum. We're very glad to have him. His project explores the creation of graphic history as a visual form of historical interpretation and storytelling. He has, above all this, 2 forthcoming books about Canadian military history: Scandalous Conduct, Canadian Officers Court-Martial 1914 to 1945, will be published by UBC Press in early 2022 as part of the Canadian War Museum Studies in Canadian Military History series. And he has also illustrated and co-wrote with historian Robert Engen Through Their Eyes, a graphic history of Hill 70 and the First World War, set to be published by McGill Queen's University Press next year. So I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to introduce him, and I hope everyone enjoys the discussion this evening.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks to Jeff and Eric and everyone who has helped make this great series happen. The story I'm sharing this evening is based on my CMH article called You Would Be Expected to Crack, which, like this talk, is fully illustrated by me. As the screen shared. There we go. So let's just jump right in. It is now mid-August 1944. Operation Tractable is set for August 14th. The objective is to close the Falaise Gap and capture or destroy German troops before they can escape. At noon on August 14th, 4th Canadian Armored Division advances along with its 4th Armored Brigade, led by Brigadier Leslie Booth. The operation gets off to a less than promising start. The Germans inflict severe casualties on the Canadians, and Booth is killed when his tank is hit by enemy fire. Now imagine yourself in this confusing and stressful context as a reinforcement officer recently assigned to the Lake Superior Regiment, or LSR, within the 4th Brigade. For soldiers in that unit, the chain of command seems to be in a concerning state of flux. The brigadier is dead. The LSR commanding officer has been injured and replaced less than a week ago. And now there's a new platoon leader set to arrive on the scene. When junior officers were killed or wounded, replacements were usually transferred from reserve units behind the lines. So you, as a reinforcement lieutenant, arrive to the LSR with the commission and qualifications of an officer, but not necessarily with the combat experience. In this scenario, you had enlisted in late 1940 and had been a sergeant in the peacetime Lake Superior Regiment. By summer 1942, you had been promoted and commissioned as a lieutenant. You've had a largely undistinguished military career up to this point, and had mostly served in an administrative capacity since arriving to England in late 1942. You've been assigned to France a month after D-Day, but not as part of the LSR. You have yet to receive a combat posting. So for the past month, since July, you've been bored and anxious in a holding unit while waiting for where and when you'll be sent next. Now your chance is finally here. You are set to rejoin the LSR, a motorized infantry regiment, in the middle of an important operation that has vital consequences for the war. The date is now August 16th. Operation Tractable is still underway, and there is much heavy fighting still ahead. As a newly arrived lieutenant, you're put in charge of a platoon. Since you had served with this unit in England and Canada, you know some of the men personally, but many other strangers. Besides, you and they have now witnessed very different things since the early days of training. Most of your soldiers have now been through the baptism of combat, which is certainly more than you as a raw lieutenant have experienced. You had gone through battle drills and completed various qualification courses, but it is entirely different than being in the field, especially with the responsibility of 30 or so men under your direct command. You don't even have 24 hours to prepare. The regiment is set to move out the next day, August 17th. As motorized infantry, your job is to support the tanks of the armored regiments in the 4th Brigade. You lead the platoon from a command vehicle, perhaps a half-track, perhaps a universal carrier, as I've pictured here. Everything seems to be going well. The regiment advances towards the French town of Troon. Then at 12 noon, it happens. The regiment comes under enemy fire. 88mm shells and mortars explode near your vehicle. You see German planes buzzing around. Perhaps they are dropping bombs as well, but you can't be sure. It seems like a full ground and air assault. Other men and officers in the advancing column seem to know what to do. They jump from their vehicles and take cover in the bushes and split trenches along the side of the road. You do likewise. After half an hour of enemy shelling dies down, the regiment needs some time to regroup, but by 3 o'clock, the advance continues. One problem. You have now disappeared. A new reinforcement officer, one day on the job, having been under enemy fire for the first, is mysteriously gone. The regiment doesn't have time to wait. Assuming you've been wounded, a sergeant takes command of your platoon. After a few weeks, authorities informed next of kin that you've been reported missing in action. So what has happened to this young officer? Meanwhile, the last you remember is being in France with your unit under enemy fire. From your perspective then, it is quite strange to suddenly wake up in a train station, which you might recognize as Waterloo Station in London. It seems like no time has passed since the action of August 17th. But now the date is October 10th, 1944. It's been nearly 2 months since that traumatic first experience in battle. Confused about how you ended up in a London train station, and remembering virtually nothing about who you even are, the next logical step is to go to Canadian military headquarters in the city. Maybe officials there can figure out what happened. At least you remember that you belong to the Canadian Army and have the sense to know that something is very wrong. Upon arrival at CMHQ, you explain this unusual situation to a somewhat skeptical major. He consults with the personnel records and discovers your identity as that missing lieutenant. At last, you have a name. This entire scenario has described the strange, curious case of Lieutenant Reginald James Woods, a 25-year-old officer, platoon leader in the Lake Superior Regiment. Suspecting Woods suffered amnesia, he is sent to the neurological hospital at Basingstoke. There, he slowly regained his memories and identity. Under hypnosis, a medical officer asked him to write down his biography. He was born in Port Arthur, Ontario in 1919. He worked at the local Zellers as a stock clerk. He joined the LSR in 1935 and rose to the rank of sergeant. After volunteering for the active army in 1940, he reverted in rank to private to go overseas. By summer 1942, Woods had earned a commission. While training in England, he had encountered trouble commanding his platoon, and felt ill-treated by his CO. He had been shuffled around to different administrative duties in England before finally being posted to France, as I had described. Despite the hypnosis and this biographic sketch, the gap in his memory between August 17th and October 10th remained. Woods claimed he simply could not remember what happened after the attack or how he suddenly found himself in Waterloo Station in London. In this talk, I use his unique story to explore issues surrounding the Canadian experience in Normandy, particularly related to three topics: combat leadership, battle exhaustion, and finally, courts-martial and punishment. I'll return to Woods' experiences throughout this talk to show how he navigated complex medical, administrative, and legal issues as the Canadian Army attempted to find out what happened. We begin with the role and duties of a junior officer like Lieutenant Woods. As Jeff Hayes has explained in his book, Career as Lieutenants, the Canadian Army relied on a complex process of inventing its junior officers. The concept of a male army officer as a temperate hero reflected older regimental traditions, new social scientific theories, as well as ideas about intelligence, education, and masculinity. The job of a platoon leader entailed complex technical duties, as well as looking after the welfare of soldiers under an officer's direct command. In battle, junior officers assumed a very dangerous position. Lieutenants made up a disproportionate number of casualties in the Canadian Army. In Normandy, it was not unusual for new reinforcement officers to join a regiment and be killed within days or weeks. Although in this talk, I focus on a case of perceived officer misconduct, I think we can acknowledge that most Canadian officers performed very well under fire, or at least did their best under very stressful and trying conditions. So that might make an exceptional case like Woods seem like an outlier that we can perhaps overlook. But rather than an isolated example unit level failure in battle, I think Woods' disappearance should be understood from the perspective of breakdowns in leadership, also at the battalion, brigade, and division levels. I'm not going to get into the controversies over Canadian overall performance and leadership during the Operation Tractable. I simply wish to point out that more was happening in 4 Armored Brigade that places Woods' behavior in context. The LSRCO had been wounded in early August, which caused his removal. But he was one of several battalion commanders in Normandy who had been proven to be somewhat unreliable. Under the stressful conditions, even some generals began to show signs of cracking. Major General George Kitching of the 4th Division later admitted he had discovered Brigadier Leslie Booth drunk in his tank in early August. Such a serious breach in discipline likely warranted a charge by court-martial, but Kitching had only privately reprimanded his brigadier. Booth's death days later, and Kitching's post-war discretion, meant that the knowledge of this episode did not become more widely known for years. In part due to the perceived delay of Operation Tractable to close the Falaise Gap, and due to concerns about his lack of drive, Kitching himself was relieved from command and demoted on August 21st. The removal of Kitching, the replacement of the LSRCO, the drunkenness of Booth, and the apparent disappearance of Woods all highlighted how the Normandy campaign could expose problems in command at all levels. It shows how fluid this situation was. The soldier in Woods' platoon would have seen almost the entire command hierarchy change in a matter of weeks. These examples highlight the tremendous pressures and leadership challenges involved in the complexity of an ever-changing battlefield, especially for new officers. We now turn to the issue of battle exhaustion. Apparent breakdowns in leadership must also be viewed from the psychological and mental health perspective. In addition to thousands of Canadians killed in Normandy in summer 1944, about a quarter of the non-fatal casualties succumbed to emotional exhaustion or neuropsychiatric injury. Attitudes towards combat stress had shifted since the First World War. In 1916, most sufferers had been labeled with shell shock. Some doctors thought the cause was connected to a concussion blast or from the depletion of nervous energy. By 1944, the diagnosis had become battle exhaustion. The term implied a prolonged nervous strain from combat stress. Symptoms included fear reactions and anxiety, shaking, hypersensitivity to loud sounds, or malaise and confusion. Although every service member had a breaking point when willpower became depleted, commanders and medical officers viewed with suspicion those who cracked under less than perceived severe conditions. Doctors, therefore, were tasked to detect instances of feigned mental illness. The terminology that was used often implied personal deficiencies and failings on the part of these suspected cases of feigned battle exhaustion. In the Air Force, the term was lack of moral fiber, while in the Army, the term was lack of intestinal fortitude or lack of guts. Worn out but proven veterans who wavered were more likely to receive understanding and lenient treatment. New reinforcements who showed nerves or seemed to collapse too quickly were often stigmatized as predisposed to emotional instability. Rather than combat stress, the underlying causes were claimed to be personal issues, mental abnormality, or weak character. In such cases, military authorities deemed discipline and punishment as more appropriate to an apparent unwillingness to fight. To return to Woods' situation, Canadian authorities needed to determine, was he a battle exhaustion case deserving treatment, or a disciplinary problem deserving punishment? From a medical perspective, the nature of Woods' condition came down to three questions. Was it a genuine illness? Was it caused by combat? And was he mentally competent to have distinguished right from wrong? When he suddenly reappeared at CMHQ on October 10th, Woods was sent to No. 1 Neurological Hospital at Basingstoke, otherwise known as No. 1 Nuts. There, he was subjected to observation and hypnosis, as I had described. One specialist suspected that Woods' apparent amnesia had resulted from hysteria, but he could not confirm whether the condition had been triggered by combat stress alone, by an already anxious personality, or some combination of the two. But at least this doctor believed the condition genuine. The commanding officer of the neuropsychiatric units at Basingstoke, Lieutenant Colonel C.E.G. Gould, was more definitive. He believed Woods was faking to conceal deliberate misconduct in France. Gould personally felt it would be a mistake for Woods to have joined the infantry reinforcement stream in the first place. The doctor felt this young lieutenant temperamentally unsuited to lead men in battle. At the same time, Gould also found no evidence of a genuine psychiatric illness that could mitigate the crime of desertion. According to Gould, most officers who proved unsuitable or incompetent were problems of personal selection and training rather than mental illness. Gould felt too many were being diagnosed as battle exhaustion cases after what he called mild exposure to combat. After being a patient at Basingstoke for 3 weeks, Woods disappeared again in November. He was soon found by the civil police and returned to the hospital. For Gould, this was more evidence that Woods was feigning mental illness. He discharged the patient with no appreciable disease, and Woods was placed under arrest. We now come to courts-martial and military justice. For a brief overview, there were several different types of court-martial: summary, district, standing, field general, and general. We're concerned with general. That is the process that officers were tried by. A general court-martial depended on the judgment of at least 5 senior officers. A legal officer acted as prosecutor, while another officer, usually with legal training, acted as defense counsel. Sometimes accused officers defended themselves, but that was not advised. The court needed to determine guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The proceedings largely resembled a criminal court setting. There was the presumption of innocence, the burden of proof rested with the prosecution, and there was testimony from superiors, subordinates, and other witnesses. As required, there was expert medical testimony and technical legal arguments about due process and procedure. A judge advocate presided to give advice on matters of military law and evidence. But decision-making power ultimately rested with the court. Although a court-martial was adversarial in nature, like a criminal trial, it was supposed to function as an inquiry into the accused's alleged conduct. The court determined that by a majority vote, and if guilty, voted on punishment. In that case, the court's finding and sentence moved up the chain of command for confirmation. In Canada and the United Kingdom, general courts-martial tried officers for all kinds of offenses under the Army Act, from drunkenness and absence without leave to dishonored checks and conduct unbecoming an officer and gentleman. In the Second World War, there were about 550 general courts-martial of Army officers in the UK, in Canada, and in continental Europe. There were several punishments available in guilty verdicts. The lowest were reprimand, severe reprimand, and loss of seniority. Convicted officers kept their commissions, but now had a blot on their records. Much more severe was expulsion, of which there were 2 forms: dismissal and cashiering. Historically, cashiering was the most disgraceful form of expulsion from military service in British Army tradition. In a ritualized ceremony before fellow officers, the offender's rank pips and badges were torn from his uniform. By another historical custom, which was also unevenly enforced in practice, a cashiered ex-officer could never again serve the crown in a military or civil capacity. In today's military justice system, there are 2 called dismissal and dismissal with disgrace. Notably today, those sentences apply to all ranks and are based on the severity of the crime. In the Second World War, dismissal and cashiering were penalties exclusive to officers. In rare cases, the court could impose a prison sentence in addition to cashiering. Overall in Normandy, although cases of battle exhaustion were high, the Canadian Army discipline and morale was generally good. There were some charges against privates and NCOs related to desertion, absence without leave, and self-inflicted wounding. But as we learned from the talk 2 weeks ago, even seeming high statistics for AWOL did not necessarily indicate disciplinary problems or bad performance. Commanding officers often tolerated soldiers' short absences during quiet periods, with the understanding that they would return. It became a disciplinary problem when they didn't come back, or if the offense occurred in battle. In this way, the apparent desertion of Woods stands out, both for the severity of the crime and the fact that he was an officer. But the case reveals much about how the court-martial process functioned. By November 1944, Woods was discharged from Basingstoke. He now became a target of the military justice system. Authorities placed him under arrest and returned him to the LSR, which was now in Holland, where a summary of evidence could be recorded. Initially, Woods faced 2 charges under the Army Act: Section 12, desertion with intent to avoid the enemy, and Section 5(7), cowardice. This charge was dropped because it was always difficult to prove that an accused was motivated by outright cowardice. The court-martial took place in the United Kingdom on February 13th, 1945. To briefly introduce the participants in Woods' trial, the judge advocate was Major G.M. Graham, a Nova Scotia lawyer. The court president was former PPCLI commanding officer Colonel Cameron Ware, and the other 4 court-martial members were all senior officers with combat experience. The prosecutor was Captain Elliot Maris, a Toronto lawyer, and the defense counsel was Lieutenant J. Cormack, a Calgary criminal lawyer. And of course, there was the accused, Lieutenant Woods. The prosecutor's job was to prove that Woods had deliberately deserted from battle on August 17th with no evident intention to return. The defense counsel needed only to leave a trace of reasonable doubt in the court's mind. He argued that Woods had suffered some mental break. He was not responsible for his actions that day and for the next 2 months. Maris began by trying to paint a picture for the court of what happened in the LSR on August 17th. He called a number of witnesses from the regiment who all confirmed that they had come under enemy fire, but many described a relatively routine attack, at least for those who had seen combat before. McCormick had a brief cross-examination of each of these prosecution witnesses. He focused on the question of cowardice and fear. Had any of these men, 1 officer, 1 sergeant, and 2 drivers, suspected Woods was afraid or behaved abnormally? None did. The prosecution faced a challenge to fill in gaps after Woods' disappearance. His next witness was an English woman who was a friend of Woods. On August 21st, 4 days after he went missing, this woman came across Woods wandering the streets of Brighton. He seemed to be in a daze, extremely nervous. He mentioned something about being on leave, but was not talkative. She took care of him for a few days, then he vanished again until he turned up at CMHQ on October 10th. The prosecution now turns to the medical evidence. Maris needed to rebut any notion that Woods had suffered a mental breakdown or that this desertion could be attributed to illness. The prosecutor now came to his main witness, the one who could confirm Woods was a willful deserter, a liar, and a malingerer, Dr. Gould, commanding officer of No. 1 Nuts at Basingstoke. He recounted how in hospital he had slowly chipped away at Woods' defenses and evasions to get at the truth. Suddenly, in the middle of Gould's testimony, an objection from McCormick. The defense counsel argued that any testimony from Gould about what Woods may have said at the hospital could not be admitted into evidence. When Woods was held at Basingstoke, he was as much a prisoner as he was a patient. Gould was not only a doctor, but a colonel in the Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps, therefore a superior officer. Citing the Manual of Military Law, McCormick argues what Gould was about to testify amounted to a forced confession from Woods. At this point, Judge Advocate Major Graham was becoming annoyed. Courts-martial were designed to be quick and efficient. These objections were slowing the process. He ruled that Woods' statements to the doctor had been voluntary and therefore admissible. It was up to the courts to make that decision, but they deferred to the judge advocate. Gould now proceeded with his testimony. He claimed that Woods finally confessed while being a patient at Basingstoke. He had made up the amnesia story from the start. He remembered everything that had happened since. He was afraid of the shelling and fled. He'd somehow hitchhiked by truck to the French coast, then boarded a ship headed for Brighton. He had stayed there in the town with a friend for a few days, then he went away again. He decided to turn himself in on October 10th and hoped to avoid responsibility by claiming battle exhaustion and memory loss. The prosecution now rested. Once that confession was admitted into evidence, there was little McCormick could do. He expressed his objections again, but was firmly rebuked by Graham. If he pushed the argument further, he might do more damage to his clients. Likely best just to wrap up the case. In his closing remarks, McCormick made the case that what happened on August 17th was beyond his client's control. I'll quote part of McCormick's statement to the court in his final plea. He would be expected to crack. You all know the meaning of that because you all have had battle experience. You know the strain that comes to a normal man when under shell fire. You can imagine how much more difficult that must be to a man with any mental disease to stand up to a bombardment. End quote. In his sum up, Judge Advocate Graham didn't really try to hide whose side he was on. He remarked that the case ultimately came down to, did the court believe Woods' story of amnesia? Now, this is an odd remark because it places the burden of proof on the defense to establish innocence. After considering the evidence and arguments, the court returned with its verdict several hours later. Woods was found guilty of desertion and sentenced to cashiering plus 12 years penal servitude. This was the harshest penalty awarded to any Canadian officer for the entire war. Higher authorities confirmed the court's finding, but reduced the prison term to 5 years. Woods began his penal servitude at one of His Majesty's prisons in March 1945. He eventually found himself in the famous Dartmoor prison. Over the next many months, Woods wrote appeals and petitions for his release. He promised to re-enlist as a private to redeem his honor. I'll quote one of the petitions. He says, "I'm afraid this whole thing is going to break up things between myself and my wife. If I cannot give her the proper support, she has clearly threatened to leave me. I would like to get back and prove myself on any front, which I know I can do. I don't really think I'm a menace to society. I have only one desire, and that is to be back in the army, preferably in a fighting unit, so that I can prove conclusively that when given equal opportunities, I am better than the next man." End quote. All the appeals were rejected. Woods spent a year in prison overseas before being sent back to serve the remainder of his term in Canada in March 1946. Now, about this time, Woods' case came across the desk of Canada's Judge Advocate General, R.G. Ord. Ord realized that the court-martial had made a serious error in allowing that confession Woods is alleged to have made to Gould at Basingstoke. Judge Advocate Graham should have advised the court of the need to first assess its admissibility of evidence. They had not done so, and therefore violated the rights of the accused. With the JAG's recommendation, Woods' sentence was quashed in June 1946. He was freed from Fort Henry, where he had been held since returning to Canada. Because the verdict was overturned, Woods was now technically reinstated as an officer in the Canadian Army, but not for long. By August 1946, 2 years after the saga began, he was compelled to retire his commission. But the story doesn't quite end there. Army leadership wasn't pleased about this result. From their perspective, a deserter got off easy with a legal technicality. The Army Adjutant General wanted to enforce a financial penalty against Woods. From Woods' disappearance on August 17th, 1944, until his exoneration in June 1946, he had received no pay. The Army wanted to keep it that way. No military service, no pay. The JAG countered that Woods' time as a patient at Basingstoke, under arrest at trial, and while imprisoned, couldn't exactly be called a voluntary neglect of duty. In the end, Woods only lost back pay for his absence between August 17th until his reappearance at CMHQ on October 10th. So he lost 55 days pay as opposed to 22 months. Because he was now considered to be honorably retired from the Army, he also received his war service gratuity and other veteran benefits. With his military service finished, Woods returned to civilian life. During the Korean War, Woods in fact offered his services again to the Canadian Army, but he was turned down. By the mid-1950s, he had moved to the United States with his wife and children. He died in Arizona in February 1999 at the age of 79. As we reach the conclusion of this story, what's the significance of Woods' experience to our understanding of Canadians at Normandy? First, I think it highlights the speed and precarious nature of the operation. Reinforcement junior officers suddenly could find themselves leading a platoon in the middle of battle with no combat experience. The shocking part of the story isn't so much that Woods broke down, but it's how exceptional his case is. Many reinforcement officers were killed not long after their arrival. Yet despite the extraordinary circumstances, many new officers adapted. A court-martial for failure in battle was very rare. When it did happen, the ability for other officers and NCOs to take over reveals how they could adapt quickly to unexpected and challenging circumstances. At the same time, Woods' experience with battle exhaustion should remind us that combat stress could potentially affect anyone, and it manifests itself in very unusual ways. His defense counsel stated that Woods would be expected to crack. This argument tried to make his collapse seem inevitable, and therefore not the accused's fault. Medical experts like Gould agreed Woods was temperamentally unsuited to combat, but nevertheless felt he was still criminally liable. But the belief that some men could be identified as simply prone to collapse due to inherent psychological and emotional issues, I think ignores the complexity involved in combat stress reactions and the challenge to have predicted how any person would cope under fire. This leads us to consider the difficulty for historians to pierce the fog of war and create a coherent narrative out of inherently chaotic events. This is one of the reasons why I took an illustrated approach to telling this story. Through my drawing, I emphasize that what is being presented here is incomplete. It's pieced together from evidence fragments and conflicting testimony. As an example, compare the accounts of Woods and the prosecutor visualized on the screen. The gap in Woods' version should be obvious. But while the prosecutor seems to have related a complete narrative, the gaps are less apparent. The blank spaces between each image represent the gaps in his story as well. Whatever happened to Woods in the weeks before he suddenly turned himself in to CMHQ on October 10th remain a mystery. His motivation and liability are also never fully addressed because of the court's error in permitting that forced confession. The final takeaway from this story is about the court-martial process itself. It was an instrument, first and foremost, of discipline and deterrence. The sentence of cashiering plus 12 years imprisonment was truly exceptional. Even with the reduction to 5 years, that punishment was very high for an officer. Canadian privates and NCOs convicted of cowardice or desertion were usually sentenced to no more than 3 or 5 years. Now, compared to American soldiers and officers, these prison terms would actually seem fairly light. But for Canadian officers, prison was rare. At the same time, as we can see, there were checks and balances in the martial justice system. It may have taken a year, but eventually Woods' conviction was quashed because the court failed to follow proper procedure. By only forfeiting a fraction of Woods' pay, Army administration struck a compromise that acknowledged he had been illegally absent for causes unknown, but avoided passing judgment on his mental health at the time. What truly happened with Woods after his disappearance on August 17th and over the next 2 months, I don't think we can fully know. But the reactions to his case reveal much about how the Canadian Army grappled with discipline and battle exhaustion at Normandy and after. I'll end by mentioning that if you want to learn more fascinating stories of misconduct, which sometimes include equally compelling stories of redemption, I have many more in my forthcoming book, Scandalous Conduct, due to be published by UBC Press next year. And if you're interested in my graphic style approach to the past, I illustrated and co-wrote with historian Rob Engen a First World War graphic history, which is set to be published by McGill Queen's University Press also next year. And the story of Woods, which I just shared with you today, is also found in my CMH article entitled, "He Would Be Expected to Crack." So thank you for your attention and time this evening. I certainly hope I can answer any questions that you may have. So thank you.
Thanks, Matthew. That was terrific. We've got a body of questions, and since I've kind of done some work on this stuff, I have lots of questions. So, you know, this will, oh, I'm supposed to start my video. There we are. Okay, thank you. We've got, I'll start with some of the questions that have been raised, some neat discussions there about both the content and Lieutenant Woods, and as well, we can talk a little bit perhaps too about the graphic approach as well, which I think you're kind of one of the leaders in Canada for adopting it, which is great. You're a great illustrator as well as a great historian. So we'll just go through some of these questions here, and then I'll kind of jump in too, because I've got lots. This is from Howard Hisdow. I hope I'm saying that right, Howard. Did Lieutenant Woods sustain any sort of head injury or concussion in combat or training? Was there any discussion of a kind of physical diagnosis for what might explain what happened? And was Lieutenant Woods helped by local French people? Was there any way that he could communicate to civilians? Would that have been a part of the missing narrative?
Thank you for bringing up the issue of possible concussion, because that actually there is some evidence of that he claimed. He didn't directly claim to have been blown up by a shell per se, but he did claim that he had been near explosions when he returned to Brighton, and he had met the woman that I had mentioned, or his friend. She had noticed that there was a hemorrhage in his ear, which indicates a possible head injury. But there's nothing in the medical records themselves that says that they looked really at a physical cause. So it seems plausible that he had suffered a concussion injury, but it seemed like that the medical officers, especially Gould, didn't really give that any credence and thought that Woods was simply feigning the entire thing. In terms of any help from French people, I think that that's also plausible. It does seem remarkable to me that someone can leave a battle zone under fire with an advancing column and hitchhike, if that story is to be believed, back to the French coast and somehow steal away on a ship and then arrive in Brighton, and then he's completely untraceable after that until he turns himself in. So it's possible that he got some help. You would think he would have to, because I don't see exactly how someone would manage to do that. It's a remarkable feat when you really kind of stop and think about it.
Yeah, that's true. And you mentioned too, I'm trying to figure out the narrative. He's discovered in Waterloo Station, goes to Canadian military headquarters. They send him to Basingstoke, where Dr. Gould assesses him. And then he left again, and he's gone for a few weeks. So how do we fit that in? What kind of, how did he find himself at the court-martial there?
Well, the reason why I don't talk about it in the court-martial is McCormick was successful in keeping that out of the testimony. Because, I mean, technically, leaving a hospital without permission would be a separate offense. And the prosecution didn't decide not to prosecute him for that. So what seemed to happen was he was admitted to Basingstoke, was there for a few days. He was kind of, or a few weeks, he was kind of concerned because he was getting conflicting diagnoses. One doctor, the one who gave him hypnosis, seemed to think it was genuine. So Woods thought, okay, my condition's being validated. Then Gould comes in and says, this guy's faking it. Like, come on, tell the truth. Yeah. And so, he has this kind of crisis of he doesn't know what to do. So by the reports, the police report at the time, he fled the hospital, went back to Brighton, went back to this woman's house he had first met on August 21st. He was there for a few days, and then the police arrived, took him back in early November. And for Gould, this was confirmation that he was faking, because before Woods had left the hospital, Gould claims that he finally got the confession out of him. And then he thinks, okay, Woods just fled again to try to validate his amnesia and his condition after he just told me the truth. So for Gould, that was just kind of like, okay, I think I know what's going on.
Oh, I see. Okay. This is a comment from past commanding officer of the Lake Superior Scottish Regiment, which perpetuates the Lake Superior Motors that Lieutenant Woods was a part of back in 1944. Just a comment, which again is fascinating, the idea that this was part of regimental lore. Thank you for finding the story of Reg Woods. This has been a topic mentioned obliquely by some of the Lake Sups veterans I have known. None would talk about it in much detail. The implied message was that they did not believe Woods. Unfortunately, they have now passed away, so I cannot follow up with them. And looking forward to read the book and your website. So it's interesting that this was something that people obviously talked about in the regimental mess over the years. And And no doubt, I mean, it's a question too of how unusual this is. I mean, it is unusual in many ways, isn't it? But particularly for the punishment imposed.
Mhm.
Cashiered in 12 years in Dartmoor. Holy cow. As grim a place as you could ever imagine in English kind of prison history. But so they were clearly trying to make an example of him but not fully understanding, I guess, but still debating the kind of idea, which I suppose we still are. Is this a disciplinary case or is this a medical psychological case?
Exactly. Yeah. And that's a fascinating comment. I'm very interested to learn more if there was kind of these stories circulating among veterans about Reg Woods, because that's something that I didn't really have access to from my book and didn't really know how to fit it in. I mean, I look at officers who are dismissed and cashiered, and I wondered, like, how did veterans necessarily feel about some of these people? And so that's something that I didn't really know about. So that's a really interesting kind of other part of the story. And it's also a little interesting that some veterans would have been more skeptical of Woods, possibly related to the fact that this was his first day in battle.
Yeah. Question from Dale Ingry. Was there a culture of blaming junior officers and enlisted men for their cowardice this is a heavy question, in order to avoid accepting responsibility for ill-considered battlefield decisions?
Yeah, I think there might be something to that. I don't want to say definitively that there would be, but if you just look at the court-martial record, overwhelmingly for officer cases, it's lieutenants. It's those who are in the thick of the fighting, who, if they make a wrong decision or they hesitate, then it's going to be on them to be liable. I haven't come across anyone really above captain that would have a kind of a purely military misconduct charge. I mean, you get lots, embezzlement, drunkenness, all those sorts of things. But military misconduct seems to be almost exclusively junior officers and NCOs and privates. So I don't know if you can necessarily say that this is simply deflecting blame, but I think it has to do with who is in a position to possibly fail or make a mistake and then be held liable. I mean, to look at Leslie Booth's indiscretion about apparently being drunk in his tank, if that had been a junior officer, likely he would have been charged with drunkenness, possibly dismissed. But for a brigadier, it's too scandalous to bring a court-martial. Bad for morale. And just logistically, it's difficult of having a high-ranked officer charged in the field, because you would need a court of his peers, and everyone's busy trying to fight the war.
Yeah. Maybe I'll follow up with, is there a regular force militia bias here? I mean, it sounds as if, so much of it depends on which, not only the court-martial, but in terms of who gets to assess him. And Gould presumably is professional regular force, and that may well have, and Cameron Ware is the president. I don't know. Is there a different measure that a professional regular force, permanent force as they called them then, officer would have imposed upon the regular force, upon the militia?
There does seem to be a little bit of a bias in favor of permanent force members. There's a case in England of a permanent force officer who is just a few weeks really, from his reaching 20 years in the permanent force, and therefore could collect his lifelong pension.
Right.
He's dismissed a few weeks short of that, cashiered actually, for drunkenness, insulting the king, various other kind of indiscretions. And after the war, permanent force officers, who are the ones in charge of the Canadian Army, look at that case and they have sympathy for this person who's now been cast out of the permanent force of the military. He has nothing really to fall back on. He has lost his pension. So they find a way of not giving him the full pension, but giving him something. You don't see that for either militia or just the ones who just had volunteered. For them, it's pretty much, you're not going to be having that sentence ever overturned.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Change gears a little bit here, Matthew. Dave Alexander from Moen Sound, Ontario. Well done, Matthew, with an exclamation mark there. That's good. Graphic histories are an innovative and compelling way to convey history. Teachers use graphic histories to engage students who experience learning challenges, but are keen visual learners. And have you been able to gauge the success of your work? For example, is there an evolving audience for graphic histories among younger Canadians?
There certainly seems to be. I kind of got into graphic history, both from my just natural interest in illustration and art, but I also did some work for the Hill 70 Memorial Project, which some listeners may know about. And they had an entire education package that they had built. And I did a few graphic novels for that, which would supplement some of their curriculum. And they went out to schools, and we had great enthusiasm, I think, from other teachers. And I think that it's even graphic history, or these kind of graphic ways of communicating information, or moving beyond even just something for visual learners exclusively, or even for younger students. I mean, you're starting to see them in universities now. There's an entire kind of field that's developing around how do we communicate this information graphically. So I think that it's slowly growing as people are looking at text is obviously the main way that we academics express ourselves, but there are other ways to reach out to different audiences that may not pick up a dense academic book, like my scandalous conduct book, maybe.
Good plug.
Or maybe there could be a graphic translation of that book at some point.
Jeff, do you mind if I hop in?
Please.
Matt, I'm actually really fascinating with this graphic history approach, and I thought Dave's question is a good kind of segue into asking a couple more about it. I guess I'm wondering when you got interested in doing graphic history as like as a supplement to, as kind of, you know, we know as traditional academic history, and why it, and how you started to realize its usefulness in doing history.
Yeah, thanks. It's a really great question. So I mentioned before about the Hill 70 work I'd done, and I mean, that was successful for their curriculum packages, but I hadn't really thought about translating it into my academic work. I kind of kept those two things separate. And a couple of years ago, when I was thinking about doing a postdoc, Tim Cook had approached me and thought we could work something together and do a postdoc at the War Museum. And so I was thinking of what's the topic that I could look at, what kind of fits with the mandate of the museum to kind of reach out to different audiences. And I thought, well, wait a second, I'm doing this art, I'm doing these drawings. Why can't it be an academic?
We're losing him a bit, aren't we, Eric?
Yeah. Hopefully he'll come back in.
Let's hope. Let's hope. Eric had mentioned to us all that Matthew lives in a rural area, so the internet isn't quite as accessible at that part. So we're hoping that Matthew will come back here.
Mm-hmm. I guess in the meantime, I can say for those who maybe tuned in later haven't looked in the chat function yet, I've posted several links to some of Matt's work through
Am I
the
back?
You're back.
Okay, good.
All right. We thought you had gone AWOL.
Yeah, maybe.
There's a certain irony there, I suppose. I'm glad you're back.
Matt, just before you came back on, I was just telling the folks that two of your articles. You mentioned, I think one of them, maybe both of them already in your presentation. I can't remember, but two articles are in the Canadian Military History Journal. Two issues. One is on Matt's really cool graphic history approach to I think it's through the lens of the Canadian War Museum and the work that you've been doing at the Canadian War Museum, Matt. And then also for those that might be interested in learning more about Lieutenant Reginald Woods' story, can go again to the Canadian Military History Journal and read his story in a bit more detail. And again, I've posted the links in the chat function for you all. But anyways, Matt, I'll turn it back over to you to keep talking about that graphic history approach and why you think it's so useful in doing history.
No, I think you summed it up nicely with those two CMH articles I have, and I go into more detail in the one that's kind of about the process of doing graphic history, the opportunities, the challenges of that. So I won't go on too much longer, but there are further questions to be answered.
I was struck always in the sense of your approach in trying to deal with such a complex issue as Lieutenant Woods. I mean, it's one thing to tell a kind of narrative about battle and about heroism, which are so often the kind of topics that one sees in a graphic approach. But what you've tried to do here is really fascinating, to try to kind of deal with an issue that is in some ways the opposite of heroism, and to try to discern or to figure out how we assess and how we understand the legacy of this within, as you say, these measures of leadership and battle exhaustion and court martials. Man, oh man, those are hard things to deal with. Is there a sense, and I kept seeing this, that you have a certain sympathy for Lieutenant Woods? Because I'm looking at the way in which you stage some of the frames, and I think you kind of make, maybe it's just me reading into it, but you make somebody like Dr. Gould or Major Gould into a bad guy. Am I reading too much into that?
No, I don't think so. I think it's based on kind of, graphic history is about the way that we tell stories, the kind of narrative frameworks that we use. And so the story that I'm telling, in part, is I'm telling from different perspectives of all the different witnesses, but ultimately it is through what I imagine to be Woods's perspective. Right. And so the stories, they have kind of protagonists and antagonists, and for Woods, he clearly sees Gould as his antagonist. So I do take kind of this approach of, he is the colonel, senior officer who's looking down on this junior officer, and he feels the medical gaze. So I would, it could be done differently. It could be done from Gould's perspective, and you have this kind of craven lieutenant that is evasive and lying and steals away, and he's not really to be trusted. So I would say, I would concede that it is from Wood's perspective. But then again, I wrote a book on these guys, and so I have a general sympathy for those who were dismissed and cashiered.
Yeah. No, I wasn't trying to make you concede, but
that's okay.
We've been through this before, but the idea of trying to convey your own perspective within our own writing is something we always deal with, as bias in historians. So it's fascinating to kind of get a sense of how you do it as a war artist, as it were.
Exactly.
Yeah. There was one comment that I'll just pass on, which is, I think, gone off the screen here, Eric. I'll see if I can find it here. Oh, Paul Ulrich makes the comment about the severity of his penalty, and which is, of course, overturned, but in reference to the relatively light consequences for Kurt Meyer, who, of course, was commanding 12th SS and was eventually freed from prison after having his death sentence overturned. I think he spent 6 years in Dorchester Penitentiary before he's returned back to Canada. So again, it provides some sense. That's a slightly different issue as far as how these sentences are sometimes not overturned, but reduced after the war. And that's
It's a good
something
point. It's a good point though, because when Myers is released, there are members of parliament who point out, well, wait a second, we've court-martialed our own people. We've sentenced them to be cashiers, which has a certain civil disability of you can't serve in the military again.
Yeah.
We've sentenced them to prison, and now we're sending this Nazi general back free. And so there's a tension of, well, do we offer amnesty, pardons to those who were cashiered and dismissed during the war? And generally, the answer was no.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, yeah, it's a good point because it touches on some of the stuff that you've actually got me looking at in my own studies of court martials. David Patterson down in Kingston, Ontario. Hello, David. The Lake Superior Regiment had at best 9 days of combat service by 17 August. And though they'd been in Normandy for about a month. So his troops, that is Woods' troops, are about as green as he was.
Fair.
So his question is, was Lieutenant Woods' combat stress more attributable to being dropped into a leadership position in the middle of battle rather than a comparative lack of experience with the troops?
I think that could be part of it. I think it would be a significant challenge to be, kind of thrown into a regiment that is relatively new into the field itself. At the same time, though, I think there's this problem that we face of Woods' case is exceptional. He's one that seems to run away, for lack of a better term. And even though his soldiers may not have had a lot of experience, they had more than he did in just being in the field. And there didn't seem to be, you could look probably more deeply into the Lake Superior disciplinary record, but there wasn't anything equivalent, I don't think, to Woods at that time.
Yeah, yeah. It does strike me that there is, as Terry Kopp has said, there's lucky and unlucky regiments, and there's clearly lucky and unlucky officers. Well, lucky and unlucky soldiers. Some, especially reinforcements, are brought up in relatively quiet circumstances and allowed to have some kind of almost introduction to the battlefield. And others are, as in so many cases, brought into circumstances which even experienced troops are going to have difficulty with. And we can find that throughout the narrative of the Canadian Army, can't we? Of somebody being brought up just before a major engagement, a costly engagement. And so often those fellows are wounded or killed, or perhaps even having the difficulties, perhaps not as severe as Lieutenant Woods. And then, some other fellow who writes from the comfort of his den 50 years later says, I managed to avoid that because of the luck of the draw. There was really hard to predict in some ways, as they tried to do so hard to predict how well these fellows would stand up. It was a very difficult thing to understand how these people would do in battle. Simon Paget from Edmonton. I hope that's right, Simon. Do you think that the discipline and martial justice was the same in both world wars? Do you want to comment on that?
Well, I can't comment on it because my book tackles from First World War to the Second. So there are certain changes in terms of how something like combat stress or battle exhaustion is dealt with. So in the First World War, the overwhelming charge, and I really mean overwhelming charge, is drunkenness in the field. You don't see nearly as many drunkenness cases in the Second World War. So in part, that has to do with shifting attitudes towards drinking, but it's also about the recognition that battle exhaustion or combat stress could be mistaken for drunkenness in the First World War. So someone who seems to be acting strangely in the trenches or after they come out of the line is, well, that person must be drunk, charge him as drunkenness, and then he's dismissed. Whereas in the Second World War, drunkenness was a problem, but it was only really like right at the front line. There's one case of an officer in Italy who is manning a Bren gun. He's has this breakdown when he hears the
We're having our connection issues again with Matthew and with the internet. I think part of the point that Matthew's bringing up that's been raised in a terrific book, again, by Terry Kopp and Bill McAndrew about battle exhaustion, is that the idea of what breaks someone in battle very much changes, certainly from the First World War to the Second. And that's also reflected in some ways too, to take on, and just I hope to finish Simon's point, the idea that that there are no executions in the Canadian Army, nor in the British Army in the Second World War. So military justice is in some ways evolved to a considerable degree between the wars, because the Army Act very much changes. There you are, back again.
Yeah, I'm back.
I'm trying to fill in for you as best I can. I was just
appreciate it.
That the military justice, we don't execute people in the way that we did
exactly.
for cowardice or desertion in the First World War. And there were what, 22
25.
cases,
Yeah.
25 in the CEF in the First World War. And that is not a capital offense in the Second. So that does, I think, have some implications for how we understand it. And the other point that Terry and Bill McAndrew make in battle exhaustion is that these ideas about what shell shock and what battle exhaustion are evolve through the course of the war, or between the wars. And that too changes the way in which they're being viewed. As Matthew, you were talking about kind of how so many charges of drunkenness, far fewer in the context after 1939. Maybe you can just finish that thought.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you raise a great point about the difference in the severity of the charges of execution, and when that's abolished in 1930. In fact, 2 Canadian officers were charged with desertion and disobeying orders in the First World War, and they were sentenced to death, but it wasn't carried out. So you don't see that in the Second nearly as much. But I will mention, I kind of alluded to it briefly at the end. If you compare Canadian sentences or British sentences in the Second World War to the US Army, I mean, then it's a completely different situation in terms of imprisonment. It's officers being convicted of desertion or disobeying orders, sentenced to 50 years hard labor, life imprisonment. Now, they didn't actually serve the full time, but it just shows the difference of the sentences that are being imposed.
And I'm trying to remember the numbers of American soldiers who are executed in or as a result of actions in Normandy. And if I remember it correctly, and I'll stand corrected, but it's over 150 who are executed because of actions and because of punishments that have been meted out through the Normandy campaign. And the vast majority of them are African American.
Yeah, and yeah, exactly. And
so
most of them are
yet another element of
related to
military
allegations of rape allegations.
That's right. That's
exactly.
Right. Let me just, so Nancy Murray tells the story of her father, who testified, if I understand this correctly, at a court-martial of 2 soldiers who had fought from D-Day to Holland, had gone missing. They were found guilty and sentenced to be shot. That probably wasn't quite the case then, Nancy, just because we know that even in those kinds of cases, military justice after 1930 suspended the death penalty. So was this a common ploy by higher command to maintain discipline? Certainly court-martials were intended to maintain discipline. Whether or not that sentence was imposed, it may well have been the memory of your dad that it was, but it was likely not, just simply because of the legal changes. That was probably one of the biggest distinctions, but between the First and Second World Wars. One point of that I just saw down the list here. We'll have a few more questions, I think, and then we'll give you a rest, Matthew, after your discussion, and we'll make sure that we put in some of the links to your great articles in Canadian military history, which is canadianmilitaryhistory.ca. Here's a piece by Peter Buckley. Hello, Peter. From Horsham, England. His father, Hugh Buckley, was a first lieutenant and attended OCTU officer training in Aldershot in England after being removed from the battle near Falaise in August 11th. I didn't realize that, Peter. The story of Lieutenant Woods becomes poignant to me for that, but even more so since my father was returned to England via the Mulberry Harbor and arrived in New Haven near Brighton with a written authorization, as he told it. If Woods did something similar, would he have forged some papers to return to England? Was there any evidence that he had forgeries in his possession?
There didn't seem to be. And I think if he did, then that would more give credence to Gould's arguments that this was entirely premeditated and it was planned. Because I don't think someone in what they would call a fugue state would maybe have the wherewithal to kind of forge documents like that. So it is a mystery of how someone with an entire world war going on managed to slip away from a battle zone and then be missing for 2 months. And only because he turned himself in was he found.
Yeah, quite remarkable. Again, we've got such great questions and they're coming fast and furious. We won't be able to deal with all of them, I'm afraid. So I hope you'll bear with us and perhaps you'll find some more of your answers from some of the work by Matthew. Dr. Smale writes, were any soldiers in his platoon questioned as to what happened during the shelling, what they observed about his behavior? Generally, soldiers in such situations look to their officer for direction and leadership, which is true. How can someone just disappear from a battle scene, or was he just assumed injured or killed and left?
That seems to be what happened. So they do question Woods' driver, and they question his sergeant who takes over the platoon. The sergeant thinks it's heavy shelling, so he does corroborate Woods' description of the event. But he just assumes that Woods must have been injured and he had just been evacuated by a Jeep. His driver, he says that my only concern was to protect this vehicle. So Woods jumped out and he doesn't know what happened to him after that. There's another driver who says that Woods came to him and asked him, I can't find my vehicle. And then he sort of just wandered away. But then that's the last anyone heard of him. So they did question the soldiers, and they didn't have any animosity apparently to Woods. They just kind of gave their recollection of the events.
Yeah. One of the things that's worth noting about your work, not only about your graphic style that you're bringing, which is really great, is your work with the courts-martial records, and they've all been digitized, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're organized. As you pointed out to me when I started wading into them, and one of my students, Ryan Dion, Heroes a few weeks ago, is doing the same thing. And they really are a remarkable resource, and they really do show the enormous weight of military justice that's brought down. There's tens of thousands of cases, aren't there?
There are, yeah. and they are a fascinating source, because it's not just even military justice that we can learn about, but all sorts of things about these soldiers' private lives, about why they may have had some sort of discipline infraction, about the kind of medical assumptions that happened at the time, about ideas about criminality and who's more prone to commit an offense. So they absolutely are, and it's amazing that they're online, if not fully organized enough to find easily.
The transcripts are there, hard to organize, and the index is a little tricky to negotiate, but But as you say, for social historians, for medical historians, legal historians, they really are quite a remarkable source. And I think that's one of the important things about your work, is that we've cracked this stuff open. And I think the amount of time that you've given to this stuff and to look at the cases of officers, 550 general court martials through the war and the Second War, is really a terrific insight into not only the Normandy campaign, but it's a neat glimpse into how the Army works and how people had to negotiate their way through the Army. And I think it's really great work, and we're looking forward to your book, Matthew. And I think that, again, forgive us, but I think we'll say good night. Well, not quite, because I think a few announcements need to be made, but I just wanted to say thank you, Matthew, for agreeing to speak with us tonight and to show off some of the good work that you're doing.
Well, thank you very much. Very much appreciate it. And only dropped out twice, so came back. So much like Lieutenant Woods.
Well, you didn't get all the way to Brighton, so that's good.
Oh.
Thanks, Matthew.
Matt, I'd just like to reiterate that point from Jeff. Thanks a lot for such a great presentation. It was, as you intended it to be, the most visual of the presentations we've had throughout the Maple Leaf Route webinar series. But before I kind of wrap things up, I have some bad news actually to share with you, and that's that the speaker that we had slated to speak in 2 weeks is actually not going to be able to present. And so we've decided to move Jeff's presentation into her time slot, but at the same time, we've decided also not to fill Jeff's original time slot with anyone. So next, or I guess in 2 weeks, the next webinar will be the last in the Maple Leaf Route webinar series. Normally, or we had originally envisioned 9 webinars, but due to the cancellation of the next webinar speaker, we are only going to have 8. So the 8th and final webinar will take place on the 25th of August at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time, our usual time slot. As I said, Jeff Hayes will reflect more broadly on the Normandy campaign, bring this webinar series to a close, reflect on how the 1st Canadian Army performed at the campaign and how we remember those Canadians who died fighting during the Normandy campaign. Don't miss it. It's going to be our last one. I'll emphasize again that if you registered for this talk or any previous one, it does not mean that you have registered for all of them. So if you would like to see the final webinar live on the 25th of August, please go to our website, canadianmilitaryhistory.ca/webinar, and register for that last one. In the meantime, I hope everyone is doing well, staying as cool as they possibly can, and we will see you all in 2 weeks. Take care, everybody.